the risks of producing food are increasing every year.
On this episode of Expert Answers, we're talking food security. Across the world, the coronavirus pandemic is upending lives and disrupting business. Could it also make it harder for people to access safe and nutritious food, especially the world's poorest? To get an answer to that, I recently talked to the World Bank's Vice President for Sustainable Development, Jürgen Vogele. Jürgen, good morning. I want to kick things off with the big question. Empty supermarket shelves, they've been one of the defining images of this crisis. How concerned should everyone be? Is there a global shortage of food?
Hello and good morning, Paul. Thanks for having me on. We're not concerned about the global food shortage at this point. Fortunately, unlike the situation in 2008, when really the world food stocks were low and production was at risk, today, we had record harvests over the last 2 years, and we actually have higher food stocks around the world than we've had in a very, very long time. So in aggregate, globally, we're not very concerned. Some shelves are empty in supermarkets, as you said, that is an issue. However, in supermarkets, I'm less concerned because I think supermarkets can deal with these changes in demand, these short-term changes in demand. Of course, people are, buying more food because they're eating more food at home than they normally do, and they want to have a little bit of reserve in their shelves. But supermarkets generally can deal with this. So you have seen these images here and there, but they have not been very persistent.
So then is it simply, these empty shelves? Is this simply about panic buying, or is the pandemic disrupting the food supply chain in other ways, perhaps further up the line?
Well, so there's some of the panic buying, right? So all of a sudden, food demand increases dramatically in just a week or two, and supermarket chains have a bit of an issue trying to refill the shelves. But that's not really a concern. As I said, they can deal with it. And if you go to a supermarket today, in most places, and certainly in advanced economies around the world, there really isn't a lot of empty shelves. So they can deal with that. Now, whether or not we will get major supply disruptions globally is a question, and it is a risk. So what we absolutely don't want to see is global export bans, trade barriers being imposed by individual countries, because if that begins to happen, then we may have a major problem coming our way.
Jürgen, governments are concerned about feeding their own citizens, and they've sometimes banned the export of some foods. Can you talk a little bit about you hinted at this earlier, can you talk a little bit about what's the lesson from history here on the effectiveness of that strategy?
Well, look, at times of crisis, there is a tendency among governments to be inward-looking and say, we need to protect our own food supply, our citizens come first, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, what that does is if you aggregate it up, if several countries do that, you severely disrupt the flow across countries. And what we've learned in 2008, like 12 years ago, is when that happens, food prices shoot up. And then you will have a whole raft of things that come in its wake, including speculation. You need to understand that the majority of food is actually not traded internationally. So it's a fairly thin market, but those countries that depend on food imports from other countries, they depend on having the price, at a reasonable level. If these prices shoot up, particularly poor countries really get hurt.
It seems like a lot of international air travel, so like passenger travel, has been severely cut back. Has that same sort of effect happened on freight? And what does that mean for the effect, or what does that mean for the trade in crops and food?
Well, so it's a factor, right? Air travel and air traffic and air freight is an important factor, but it's not necessarily an important factor for the main staple crops, which are usually the ones that are affected by these export restrictions or trade restrictions. Only very high value food, or let's say cut flowers, beans, strawberries, are going through air freight. So yes, the consumers will have less access to those. Producers will be hurt if the trade is disrupted, but it's not a major concern when it comes to food security. Most of the food is transported through ships, and the ports are operating. There were some constraints. I think it's all in the news. There was some slowdown, but they do still function fairly well. Then, of course, you have the local logistics, which is a much bigger challenge in many countries.
Can you talk to me a little bit about those domestic supply chains? Do we need to worry about those breaking down and affecting the supermarket shelves that we all sort of see?
Well, we certainly see more disruption in the local supply chains than we see in the international supply chain at this point. So the basic principles that I've laid out in the global space apply domestically as well, right? So if governments try to keep the flow of food open, that's the best case scenario. But we've seen a number of governments that are not doing the right things to keep the flow of food going. And I think that's where the concern comes in.
So let's turn the page here a little bit and look at some possible solutions. What can we do, as a global community, as the bank, to help the poorest and most vulnerable access the food they need here over the next few weeks?
So as I said, the key is to get cash into people's hands and to help them maintain access to the markets and to the supply, right, on both sides. So we as an institution are looking at it from actually 4 different angles. One is the immediate disease response. The other one is a macro fiscal and financial sector stability program, which impacts that food supply chain as well to the banks. If banks are not liquid, if banks cannot continue to perform, that will disrupt the supply chain severely. Then we need to look at small and medium enterprises. How do we support the millions of small enterprises? And when you think about it, every farm is a small enterprise, sometimes a micro enterprise, but even a smallholder farm is a business.
So finally, just as we wrap up, looking ahead to the future here, what can be done, what can we do to make global food supply chains more resilient to future crises?
Well, we've been struggling with climate for a good number of years in the food system, in the agricultural sector. The risks of producing food are increasing every year. And so we need to make sure that we have climate smart agricultural programs in place that are both in reducing risk, building resilience and adaptation to what's coming, but at the same time also become part of the solution. Because the food system, as many people may not know, is actually a huge part of the climate problem. We are emitting between 25 and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in the way we produce and consume our food. So really focusing on that will build resilience into the system.
A huge thanks to Jürgen Vogele for his time. If you want to learn more about the World Bank and its response to the coronavirus pandemic, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.